Thank you. Welcome to today's briefing, the case for a Neuroscience Center of Excellence at the Food and Drug Administration. On behalf of the American Brain Coalition and in coordination with the offices of Congressional Neuroscience Caucus Co-Chair Congressman Earl Blumenauer and Brain Injury Task Force Co-Chairs Congressman Bill Pascrell and Don Bacon, thank you for joining us today. My name is Leslie Ritter. I'm the Advocacy Committee Chair for the American Brain Coalition, and I'm Associate Vice President of Federal Government Relations at the National MS Society. I'm happy to be here today with my colleagues to discuss a proposal to create a Neuroscience Center of Excellence at the FDA. So just a little bit of background to get us started. Brain diseases and disorders impose staggering personal and financial costs on Americans. More than 50 million Americans live with mental illness and brain disorders, and diseases cost the U.S. more than $1.5 trillion every year. We believe, and we hope this briefing will demonstrate, that a Neuroscience Center of Excellence would create a space for innovative, patient-centered, and transparent regulatory advances that can speed access to safe and effective brain disorders treatments and cures. So Section 306 of the Cures 2.0 legislation that was recently introduced by Congresswoman Diana DeGette and Congressman Fred Upton authorizes the creation of additional intercenter institutes at the FDA and establishes criteria that a disease condition or disorder must meet to qualify. So recently introduced legislation, HR 5435, the Bringing Regulatory Advances into Neuroscience, or BRAIN Act of 2021, would work alongside the Cures 2.0 legislation to establish that one of those centers be a Neuroscience Center of Excellence. We are thrilled to hear from Congressman Blumenauer now, who is unable to participate live in today's briefing, but wishes to address you all.
Greetings. I'm Congressman Earl Blumenauer, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak at this virtual briefing about the BRAIN Act. As you may know, my colleagues, Representatives Bill Pascrell and Don Bacon, joined me to introduce this critical legislation to establish a Neuroscience Center of Excellence at the FDA. Our legislation was inspired by the 21st Century Cures 2.0 Act, which was recently introduced by Congresswoman Diana DeGette and Congressman Fred Upton. This flurry of activity in the neuroscience legislation space is a clear signal that on both sides of the aisle, we see the need to coordinate research and centralize activities to make sure that the FDA is more responsive to the quickly changing science. It's also a strong indicator of how important it is to keep patients at the forefront of the neuroscience conversation, because they are the most impacted by new advancements, and they deserve to have their voices heard. Over 88 organizations representing patients, providers, and the healthcare industry have endorsed this legislation, further proof that this is necessary work. With over 50 million Americans affected by mental illness and brain disorders, it's critical that we address what these patients and their families are going through. In addition to that toll on our patients and their families, these problems are hitting our economy at a cost of $1.5 trillion a year. Now more than ever, we must ensure that our agencies are able to meet the need of so many Americans and provide meaningful relief. I appreciate our panelists for their work and for taking this time to speak with us, and thank you all for tuning in.
Thank you, Representative Blumenauer, along with your colleagues, Representatives Pascrell and Bacon, and your dedicated staff for all that you are doing to advance neuroscience and meet the needs of those living with brain disorders and disease. We have an expert panel here today to discuss this idea further, and there will be Q&A at the end of our time together today. So ask questions and have further dialogue. So feel free to drop questions into the question box or into the chat box. We'll be monitoring both, and we can address them during the Q&A session. Now I'd like to turn it over to my friend and colleague, Diana Fellner, ABC's treasurer and the Vice President of Public Policy at the Tourette Association of America, to introduce a very special patient advocate. Diana?
Thank you, Leslie. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Diana Fellner, and I'm Vice President of Public Policy for the Tourette Association of America. The Tourette Association of America is the only national organization serving the community, and we work to raise awareness, advance research, and provide ongoing support to patients and families impacted by Tourette syndrome and tic disorders. Tourette syndrome is a neurodevelopmental disorder that becomes evident in early childhood or adolescence. It is part of the spectrum of tic disorders and is characterized by motor and vocal tics. To be diagnosed with Tourette syndrome, you must have 2 motor and 1 vocal tic for 12 months. Motor tics are defined as sudden, rapid, recurrent, and non-rhythmic movements. Vocal tics are essentially motor tics that involve the nasal or respiratory muscles, resulting in simple sounds such as sniffing, throat clearing, or coughing, or complex vocalizations, including coprolalia. But they may also manifest with speech blocking or stuttering-like symptoms. Tourette syndrome and other tic disorders are not rare. The current estimates are that 1 out of every 160 children between the ages of 5 to 17 in the United States have Tourette syndrome, and that 1 out of 100 children has Tourette syndrome or another tic disorder. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, data suggests that 50% of children with Tourette syndrome are not diagnosed, and 83% of children with Tourette syndrome also have been diagnosed with at least 1 additional mental, behavioral, or developmental disorder as a co-occurring condition, including ADHD, OCD, anxiety, autism, or others. Most important to today's briefing, only 3 medications have been approved by the Food and Drug Administration to treat tics and Tourette syndrome: haloperidol, pimozide, and aripiprazole. These drugs are all antipsychotic medications that have contraindications, for example, heart disease, diabetes, or hyperlipidemia, and their side effects may not be tolerable for all patients. Doctors will utilize off-label drugs such as guanfacine or clonidine, which are medications that are approved for the treatment of high blood pressure that may subside some symptoms, but there is no silver bullet. In TAA's 2018 impact survey, 51% of adults reported taking medication to help manage the symptoms associated with Tourette syndrome, and 30% of those adults noted trying 5 or more medications to reach their current treatment plan. The first 2 medications, haloperidol and pimozide, were approved in the mid-80s, and aripiprazole was approved in 2002. This illustrates the need to ensure that a Neuroscience Center of Excellence will focus on conditions like Tourette syndrome, with few or no treatments approved for these conditions, to ensure our patients can get medications approved for their condition to help treat their condition. While I could talk in great detail about Tourette syndrome and its impact on our community, it is far better to hear directly from one of our TAA youth ambassadors. It is my distinct honor to introduce Natalie, a 2020 TAA Youth Ambassador from Nebraska, to share her story of living with Tourette syndrome, which underscores the need to have a Neuroscience Center of Excellence that focuses its resources on conditions like TS with few or no approved drugs. And with that, I'd like to pass it to Natalie.
Hi, everyone. As she said, my name's Natalie Burr. I'm 16 years old and I live in Omaha, Nebraska with my family. I'm a junior enrolled at Concordia Lutheran High School, and I'm a youth ambassador for the Tourette Association of America. I was officially diagnosed with Tourette syndrome about 3 years ago at the age of 13. And today I'm here to talk to you about my personal experience with Tourette syndrome, how I navigate it, how I was diagnosed, what treatments were available to me, and the challenges I've had to overcome. Until the age of 13, my life was like any other teenagers. I would hang out with my friends, play softball, and go shopping. Until one day I woke up jerking my neck violently and was unable to control it. I started shrugging my shoulders and twitching. As days passed, movements became more frequent and violent. After about a week, I started sniffing and clearing my throat. That too was also involuntary. Another couple of days passed and words started coming out of my mouth that I had no intention of saying, those words being bumblebee and polyester. I was confused as there was nothing I could do to stop it, no matter how hard I tried. A few more days later, and uncontrollable phrases, often about Hitler and bombs, came out of my mouth. And then I developed coprolalia. Coprolalia is the involuntary and repetitive obscene gestures and language that impacts approximately only 10% of people with Tourette syndrome. So imagine walking down the halls of your middle school or Christian high school saying, the F word or bullshit. I had really never said a swear word in my life up to that point. It's one thing to swear on Capitol Hill, but at your Christian high school, I was terrified. After about a week after these new and involuntary movements, I went to my primary care physician. She thought I had a movement disorder, but was not certain. She started me on a medication to ease my tics and discomfort. My movements were out of control at this point. I went back to my pediatrician a little bit later, and she said that I needed to see a neurologist, but it was a 6 to 8 month wait. My parents were ready to do anything they could. They were ready to take me to Baylor, Johns Hopkins, or UCLA because those locations had a shorter time to be seen by neurology. Those aren't short trips as to where I live in the middle of the United States, but we were desperate at this point. My mom found a neurologist at the University of Medical Nebraska Center here in Omaha that specializes in movement disorders. And he couldn't see us in the clinic for months, but my pediatrician fought for us and put a call to him anyways. He took her call and decided the fastest way for me to be seen was to be directly admitted to the hospital. That's when I met Dr. Diego Torres, the most amazing neurologist in this area. And then I was in the hospital. I don't remember much of my time in the hospital as I was very, very medicated. And I needed relief, but there was no way to tell which medication was going to work. I was started on about 3 different medications initially, and then I was put in the hospital for about a week the first time. While I was there, they did a bunch of different tests, and I saw many different types of doctors. On my 4th day in the hospital, I remember Dr. Torres saying that I have Tourette syndrome. He explained what this meant to me. He said, you will have bad days, bad weeks, bad months, and bad years, but you will also have the good days, the good weeks, good months, and good years. My life that day forward changed for the good and bad, and I knew I wanted to fight. The challenges I have faced with medications are extensive. I have tried about 12 different medications, at least, probably more. On the ramp on and off, these medications are lengthy. This means that it takes time to see if the medications work, and it takes time for me to get off of them safely if they don't. With only 3 FDA-approved medications for Tourette syndrome, I did not have a lot of options. This making it being a patient very, very difficult. This also makes being a treating physician difficult. We in the Tourette community have different co-occurring conditions such as OCD and ADHD as well. We are different as snowflakes in like a cold Nebraska storm. So try treating that. It's pretty crazy. The medication that I was put on increased my anxiety and depression. After several months, I was put on a medication called tetrabenazine that is used to treat Huntington's. It's a specialty medication and would be unaffordable. It's $4,000 to $6,000 a month if my mom didn't work at the University of Nebraska Medical Center. It helped decrease my tics enough so I could go to school. The only problem was that this medication caused suicidal ideation. The side effect I have lived with since being on that medication for almost 2 years now. I was sad and tired of living at this point, and eventually I got counseling and medicated to treat the depression. The other side effects from the medications I've experienced are aggravation, loss of appetite, being slow physically and mentally, and insomnia. I also now have to take medications to treat the side effects of the medications to help my tics. So there are so many different types of medications. After I got out of the hospital the first time, I didn't want to go to school because for my whole life, I was the quiet kid in the back seat. And now I was this person who couldn't go 2 minutes without sniffing or shaking my head or saying a cuss word. I've experienced bullying and have been made fun of several times, but guess what happens when you make fun of somebody who has tics? They typically get worse, so it doesn't do anything except make it worse. I remember when I had my very first softball game after being diagnosed with Tourette syndrome. It was a complete nightmare. I called the opposing team member an inappropriate name, and the entire team, parents on the other side, were yelling at me that I should be thrown out of the game, but they had no idea that I had Tourette. Now, before every softball game, my coach has to go through a long process of talking to the umpires and other teams, coaches, to explain that to them that I have Tourette and cannot help it. Instances like this, I have to deal with on a weekly basis. I've also struggled with addiction because I tried to help self-medicate to help get rid of my tics. I eventually self-medicated to the point where I had to go to the hospital because I was drinking too much and smoking marijuana to try and calm the tics. According to the Tourette Association of America in their 2018 impact survey, 25% of adults with Tourette syndrome reported having substance abuse. So in conclusion, there needs to be more resources and research and support. We need medications that can work so that we can prevent the hardships that people with neurological conditions have to deal with on a daily basis. Our lives are in the hands of what research has provided. And for many disorders like Tourette syndrome, there's absolutely not enough treatments. We need to make sure that resources are prioritized for conditions like Tourette syndrome with few or no treatments available. I want to have better days, better weeks, better months, and better years, but we need a neuroscience center of excellence at the FDA because people's lives like mine are counting on it.
Thank you, Natalie, for your courageous and passionate advocacy on behalf of individuals with Tourette syndrome. We want that all for you too. Natalie will be joining us later for the Q&A portion if you have any questions for her. And hearing Natalie's story really reminds us of our why we're here. That policies and legislation considered in advance by Congress really directly impact people and their families who live with these debilitating diseases of the brain. We're grateful to our audience for being here to hear how a Neuroscience Center of Excellence can help millions of Americans like Natalie who live with these diseases and conditions and endure hardships caused by brain disease to help patients have better days, better years, and better decades to come. We're also grateful to our congressional champions who are working hard to advance this policy. And we're going to get into that in our next set of speakers. So before I introduce today's speakers, a quick reminder that all of the presenters' official speaker bios can be found on the briefing invitation. Just for expedience purpose, I'll just introduce them briefly today. Our next speakers are physicians and researchers who've dedicated their lives in different ways to mitigate the impact of brain disorders. We'll hear now from my colleague at the National MS Society, Dr. Tim Kutze. Tim is the Chief Advocacy Service and Science Officer at the National MS Society. Tim was also co-chair of the National Academy of Medicine Forum Workshop on Drug Discovery and Development and Translation, which convened in 2015. And this Academy's workshop really set the stage and the discussion for the need for innovation in the development and regulation to develop novel treatments for brain diseases and disorders. So I will turn it over to Tim.
Thank you, Leslie, and thank you, Natalie, for sharing your story. You shine a light on why it's so important that we think about addressing disease of the brain. I'm going to be spending the next few minutes really laying out the case for why this is so vital and so important. And so if I could have the next slide. I think as Natalie shared in her story and as Diana have shared, there is a tremendous unmet need for to address brain diseases worldwide. It is indeed staggering to think about. More than 3 billion people in today's numbers are affected by some form of neurological disorder, which is really just profound if you think about that. Of those, some 970 million are affected by mental health disorders, and then substance abuse disorders will affect nearly 200 million people. So you can see that this is really a significant and really giant unmet need for our communities and for humanity in general. But the challenge we face, as Natalie's story illustrated, is that many of our therapies for the central nervous system are palliative or symptomatic, rather than altering the actual disease course itself. We have a tremendous need for those what we call disease-modifying therapies that will alter the course of the disease and change the journey for individuals. And this is really a challenging issue because the targets for drug development are really complex. Brain diseases in general are complex. We have really, to this day, despite, billions of dollars invested to understand how the brain is organized and functions, and we have tremendous understanding about how the brain functions, our understanding of the disease mechanisms in the brain remain poorly understood. And then we have the other challenge of, getting treatments into the brain is actually not straightforward. Our brains are protected by what we call the blood-brain barrier, which serves a really vital and important role of protecting the brain and the spinal cord from those things that could be damaging to it. The problem is the blood-brain barrier, is so effective that many treatments which would ordinarily get into the brain will not get into the brain. And so we need to overcome that to be able to address it. And all of these together, create what's illustrated on the little cartoon, this valley of death of, the challenge of taking important discoveries that NIH and so many others help facilitate and move them into industry and into people, faces this gauntlet of challenges, which gets in the way for developing, those life-changing disease-modifying treatments and life-changing symptomatic treatments for people with central nervous system diseases. And so if I could have the next slide, the cost of all of this is also substantial, both in personal, both financially and in personal impact. We've estimated, globally that the cost of brain diseases and related disorders is more than $1.5 trillion annually. With, you can see some examples of TBI being 48.3 billion, or mental health at north of 225 billion, and then substance abuse disorders, 600 billion cost annually. Those are staggering numbers. And then you add the personal cost, as Natalie illustrated. Mental disorders can account for 11% of high school and college non-completion. That brings with it a significant financial impact for the community. ER visits being related to some of these disorders. And then, of course, there are the important aspects of, stroke, Alzheimer's disease, and suicide being among the top 3 of the top 10 causes of death. Now, this really makes the case that both in financial terms and personal terms, we need to address this and find new solutions to address the therapeutic gaps that occur for brain diseases. And the next slide touches on a few more examples of why we need a new approach. And this is particularly true for the area of developing new treatments for brain diseases. I think what the pandemic has illustrated is that there is incredible power and innovation that brought us the development of, really transformational vaccine strategies, and that there is a great opportunity for remarkable innovation. But unfortunately, that is not what we're seeing within the context of brain diseases. And when you look at what it's taken to develop new drugs and new approvals between just 2016 to 2020, a 4-year period, less than 20%, 17% of those were for central nervous system or related disorder. Another challenge that we face is that the approval timelines for central nervous system focused treatments is 57% longer than for other diseases and disorders. And this is tied particularly to the challenges associated with working in the brain. And then, the other challenge, and this is one of the disincentives that creates that valley of death, is when you think about it, the probability of approval of a new drug treatment program from start to finish in the brain and central nervous system is 15%. That is staggeringly low and creates a disincentive for manufacturers and other stakeholders to pursue central nervous system disorders. And so that really shines a light on why we think the Center of Excellence is really essential, and lay out some of our rationale on the next slide, which will be built on by some of our other speakers. Why do we think a Center of Excellence is needed? First of all, it is aligned closely to the 21st Century Cures model. It builds on the aspiration of the 21st Century Cures Act to be able to create environments in which innovation can occur more quickly. It will ensure that within the context of the brain, we can keep pace with the innovation that's happening. There is remarkable scientific innovation happening across universities as well in the United States and across the globe. But to keep pace with that intellectual innovation, our regulatory systems need to keep up and continue to adapt to a much more rapid innovation environment. It also will ensure that the agency is aligned to patient need. The focus and the need of patients is critical to this work, and understanding what patients want and how that can be incorporated into drug development programs requires something like the Center of Excellence. It would also create a transparent and accountable forum for collaboration. One of the things that we're seeing is that collaboration is essential across all of the sectors, and that includes creating environments in which the regulatory parts of our system can be engaged and actually be proactively collaborating with the stakeholders. And we believe it would create a safe and effective and speedy process for there being a lot of feedback between the developers, as well as the innovators, as well as patients and the regulators. And this, an example could be what's illustrated in the slide, a new prosthesis that, could really change lives for those who live with paralysis. It would be ideal if we could see innovations like that move rapidly through development. A Center of Excellence will help us with that going forward. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Leslie to introduce our next speaker.
Thank you, Tim. Again, if you have questions, drop them in the Q&A box or in the chat box. We are recording this briefing and we will be posting it online. Sheila has posted the link in the chat box, so check that out. So now we'll hear from two experts on neurodegenerative and psychiatric illness, but it's important to emphasize what Tim just said. So the purpose of the NCOE, the Center of Excellence, would be to create tools to advance treatments for all types of brain disease. So our next speaker is Dr. Matthew Frizzo. He is board chair of the American Brain Coalition and is the Francis and Edgar Reynolds Professor and chair in the Department of Neurological Science at the University of Nebraska Medical Center. And I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Leslie, for the introduction. And thanks so much, Natalie and Mom. I mean, you guys are really courageous, and we're glad you're in Omaha and that we have an opportunity to take care of you. In fact, Dr. Torres is one of my guys. So needless to say, we're very proud of him. So I'm really happy to have a chance to talk about neurodegenerative medicine, which is kind of my bag. And I think it's very important with respect to a neuroscience center of excellence. Like Leslie said, I lead an academic neurology department, which is the Department of Neurological Sciences here at the University of Nebraska Medical Center. I also lead the neurology, neurosurgery, and neurosciences clinical programs, and I direct an NIH Great Plains IDEA Clinical and Translational Research Network. I trained as a behavioral neurologist, also have a cognitive neuroscience background, and I've spent my whole career researching and treating disorders of the brain. It's really a privilege to be chairing the American Brain Coalition Board, and the ABC has long been concerned with unmet needs for safe and effective treatments for patients with brain diseases, disorders, and as Tim pointed out, brain injuries. Drug development is advanced in our country. The FDA is continually approving therapies that improve or prolong life or cure patients with devastating conditions that were maybe even previously fatal. But as you heard from Tim and from Natalie, many of these diseases still lack effective therapies, or we're left with therapies that mitigate symptoms, and that's important, but they don't cure the problem. So we've got to focus our efforts to advance treatments that really get to the root causes of many of these debilitating conditions that plague our society. Tim said 3 billion people worldwide. That's a problem we can't afford to ignore. We've had great strides in brain science. We're learning a lot more about genetic underpinnings of mechanisms of disease, a biochemistry of conditions common and rare. And I think we have about 1,000 neurological conditions to address. And there have been parallel relevant drug, biological, and device developments. So as we make these discoveries, we need reliable mechanisms, including administrative, to get these safe and effective treatments for patients and to patients, particularly when there are unmet needs, such as we've heard about. Regarding neurodegenerative disease, I think probably most of you have seen this playing out in a relative or a friend or heard about it in other families. In clinic, I regularly see patients with neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's, frontotemporal dementia, Lewy body disease, and these are relentless conditions, and they damage progressively neurons, and they worsen thinking and moving and speaking, and the worse it gets, the more people have trouble with eating and breathing, and all along there's suffering, and eventually there's death. COVID, which we've had going on to 2 years now, has only made things a lot worse. So this whole issue of neurodegenerative diseases has been really challenging from a clinical and from research and from drug development perspectives. Despite all the progress we've made, and you read about it every day, we still don't know enough about basic mechanisms of these neurodegenerative diseases at molecular and genetic levels. And that hampers our search for precise targets for new drugs. Progress in scientific understanding of neurodegenerative diseases is a first step to developing new treatments, and we've seen it and we've read about it in HIV and cancer breakthroughs. Discovery of these specific molecular defects has led to very novel targeted approaches for cancer. You've heard about them in patients like ex-President Jimmy Carter. And these kind of advances are aided nowadays by this Oncology Center of Excellence at the FDA, made possible by the original Cures Act. So we think we need a comparably effective FDA regulatory framework for neurological and psychiatric diseases to foster safe and effective treatments for our patients, like Natalie, who you just heard from, with brain and CNS diseases. So at the ABC, we are very optimistic that these treatments and cures are forthcoming, and we keep our ear to the ground on what's happening. And we know that brain researchers keep pressing to understand more about the fundamental biology of the brain. And this includes efforts that we're close to, like the federally backed Brain Initiative, and with private investments in industry. So these two sectors, the public and private, are pursuing innovative work in neurodegenerative diseases. They're looking at things like better prognosis and diagnostic biomarkers, which is important because if you can diagnose earlier, you can treat earlier, and things are coming along. What we want to do is to work on the administrative pipeline to capitalize on these ever-growing advances. A Neuroscience Center of Excellence is going to improve patient-focused drug development. It's going to connect scientists to regulators. It's going to foster regulatory innovation. So we are very appreciative of the language in Cures 2.0 and in the BRAIN Act. And also thanks so much to Representative Blumenauer and Pascrell and Bacon, who's actually in my district. This Neurosciences Center of Excellence would leverage expertise across the FDA divisions and offices. It would facilitate shared knowledge and consistency in regulatory approaches. Folks wouldn't be working in isolated pockets in the FDA. They wouldn't be swimming in their own silos. They would be connecting and improving the efficiency of drug throughput or evaluation of drug throughput. If you don't know it, at ABC, we put patients and families first. We are very committed to patient advocacy, together with all of our sponsors, researchers, and government officials. Our idea for diseases rare and common is that a rising tide floats all boats. We believe that researchers and drug developers and patients have to work together with the FDA and its offices and its different components to find solutions together to move forward on the treatment of CNS disorders. We want to be able to develop medical products to treat neurodegenerative diseases like ALS and Parkinson's disease, Huntington's disease, Lewy body disease, the ataxias, and many more rare diseases that you've probably never heard of that have limited or no therapies. So we really appreciate what Congress is doing. We appreciate what the NIH is doing, and we're very grateful to the FDA for the attention that they've given to these devastating conditions. And at the ABC, we stand ready to assist. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rizzo. So lastly, this afternoon, we'll hear from Dr. Mark Resnick, the American Brain Coalition's Vice Chair. Mark is the Distinguished Professor of Physiology and Biophysics and Psychiatry at the University of Illinois, Chicago. So I will turn it over to you. Dr. Resnick, I think you're muted.
Okay, I'm going to try and share my screen. Now, one of the problems that we may have is that I am, it says Microsoft PowerPoint. Let's see if this works. I'm at a meeting in San Juan, and I am at a hotel with a lousy internet connection. So let's see if that, Katie, can you help me? Let's try again one more time. Oh, here we go. Here we go. All right.
Perfect.
We're working. Okay, great. So my work is on the neurobiology of depression. But before I start talking, and I'm going to give the case for an FDA Neuroscience Center of Excellence from a psychiatry perspective. But before I start, the American Brain Coalition is about the brain. And neurological and psychiatric diseases are a continuum. And Natalie's compelling remarks about her Tourette's and obsessive compulsive disorder co-occur at an alarming rate. Dr. Rizzo talked about his patients who suffer from neurodegenerative disease, and an enormous number of those patients also suffer from some type of psychotic episodes as well. So that to compartmentalize is really an artificial endeavor, and the brain is a continuum, and we need to remember that going on. But what I want to ask you before we start is, do you know what the #1 cause of disability in the world is? Anyone? It's depression, by far. In fact, in 2017, the World Health Organization said that depression was going to be the leading cause of disability by 2020, and by 2018, it already was. And we can see that neuropsychiatric disorders represent an enormous number of the disability life years in the US and Canada. In addition to that, they cost a lot of money. And that's shown here. You can see mental illness is very expensive. That was a while ago, 300 billion. It's probably closer to $500 billion right now, both direct and indirect costs. So that we're talking about something that is really expensive, both in terms of suffering and in terms of cost. Now, there are about 45,000 suicides a year. It's actually going down a little bit in the time of COVID. Most of them are related to mental illness. About 21 active duty troops or veterans complete suicide every day. But, you know, it's interesting. Although this year we've seen a spike in homicides, there still are about only a third as many homicides as there are suicides. And if you are killed by a gun, it's twice as likely to be by yourself than it is from somebody else. And I've thrown in traffic deaths and of course, drug overdoses is an enormous problem, which one would certainly classify as mental health. And one of these are conjoined problems because we have few new drugs and devices, and we also have insufficient research to develop these drugs and devices. So we're going to talk today about the importance of a neuroscience center of excellence, but it's important to remember that we also need to put pressure on increasing the amount of resources available to do the research we need in order to develop those therapies that we can bring to bear. This was something that I counted up, and I could be wrong because I'm a bad counter and I forget things. But since 2016, the FDA has approved 274 drugs or devices, only 5 of them for psychiatry. And that's in part because there were not the resources to develop new targets. The old drugs had been used up, and the idea of finding new ways to approach disease hasn't helped. Now, there have been 2 new approvals. One is for depression, esketamine and brexanolone, and maybe we'll see a rising tide of new devices and new therapies, which means we need to have a neuroscience center of excellence in order to shepherd those kind of therapies through. Now, when I say why do we need that, I'm going to talk about devices as well. Now, here's a repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation. Pretty good results, both for depression and obsessive compulsive disorder. So the idea is, here's a device, but we're talking about drugs and devices. This one is deep brain stimulation, not ready for prime time, but impressive results in terms of combating depression in a long-lasting manner. Okay. Now, one of the other problems that we're having with depression is that about 30% of the people don't get better. This is showing that each time you try a different treatment, your success rate goes down, and about a third of these people don't get better. We need to do something else. These folks are called treatment resistance. I'm not sure what that means, and I'm not sure there's something special about these people, but the fact is that we need to find new ways to help them. Okay, and in addition to that, diagnostics for psychiatric disease are pretty pathetic. Right now, we have rating scales. When you go to your primary care doctor, they say to you, are you suffering from depression, or are you not getting pleasure out of something you used to? Well, that's not very effective. But even the rating scales given by experts are not great, and frankly, they differ from rater to rater on the same subject. Genetics and genomics, well, 20 years ago, we thought that was going to solve everything, but it hasn't. Proteins and proteomics, I've shown here just a little thing. This is a paper that will be out next week. We have a simple blood test that looks like it can separate antidepressant responders from those who don't. It's a long time before we'll know if we're really right, but the idea is we need these diagnostics are devices, so that we need to think about diagnostics and therapeutics really with a single mindset, and to separate them the way that is currently being done at the FDA is not something that's very useful. Okay. So this just in terms of how well we've done in terms of psychiatry, just look at that middle thing. Look at the number of diseases that we've actually cured for psychiatry. 0. Okay. How many diagnostic tests do we have that are suggestive? 0. We have a long way to go, and we need help on many levels, and it would really be useful if we had an agency that was able to look at brain disease as a continuum and as a single entity, rather than compartmentalizing it the way that we currently do. Okay, and all right, and then how have we really impacted the suicide rate? That is also zero. What this is just showing is that despite the fact that we have such an enormous burden of psychiatric disease, we don't spend very much money doing the research to help us to bring therapies to bear. So in addition to developing a neuroscience center of excellence at the FDA, it's imperative that we invest more money in trying to understand brain disorders and develop new therapeutics. And I will stop sharing my screen there and return to the home. Thank you for listening. And again, thank you, Natalie, for your words.
And thank you, Dr. Resnick. That was fabulous, all the way from San Juan. So really well done. Thank you to all of our panelists. And I have seen some questions coming in the queue, so feel free to go ahead and add yours to the list. One of the questions that I've heard, and I'll take moderator privilege here, and this could be for any of our panelists, is really around the BRAIN Act really takes what's in Cures 2.0 and really defines one of those intercenter institutes at FDA as being a neuroscience center of excellence. So one of the questions I keep hearing is, does the FDA not already have the authority to do this? And do we really need a bill telling the FDA to do this? And I would be interested in your all's perspectives on that.
I think, Tim, you're on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it helps if you
Let's
unmute.
start with
I know.
Tim is really the guy who's thought a lot about this.
So I think the first thing to recognize, the FDA does have tools at its disposal, certainly with some of the breakthrough designations and priority review and some of those other opportunities. And those regulatory tools should continue to be used and continue to be employed. I think the challenge we find, and I'll speak, say, for example, in the case of MS, is that the reason why a center of excellence is important is that the state of the science and how clinical trials are being conducted, how the disease is being classified, how it's evolving is evolving very rapidly. And in the current time, if the community came through and said, here's how we should redefine MS, which has direct line of sight implications for how people would be recruited into clinical trials, how sponsors would determine who are the appropriate patients for the trials. There is no framework actually within the context of the agency at this point for there to be a conversation around how is the thought process evolving, how should that influence how the agency is considering the state of the science. At present, those conversations happen largely within the context of sponsors and the agency, having conversations, but there's not really a venue in which the entire community can come together to say, here's how we see the state of the science evolving. Here's how clinical trials should be influenced. Here's how sponsors are seeing that. And that's one place where, Center of Excellence, as discussed within the context of oncology, could really allow for more dynamic interchange between those individuals driving the innovation and those drug developers, as well as patients. There's really no place where all of those parties are at this table together in today's environment.
Thank you for that. One of the questions that has come in is from Margot. Would advances in pain research, treatment, and management for diseases such as fibromyalgia, PTSD, CFS, neuropathies, and others be supported by the Neuroscience Center of Excellence and/or FDA-focused programs?
Oh, this is Matt, and I believe they would be. I think they all fall, at least in part or fully, in the realm of neurological disorders. Fibromyalgia, of course, includes pain. I want to mention that, here in Nebraska, pain is part of the neurosciences service line, and I believe that treatment therapies for pain, whether the unimodal or multimodal, would be aided by Neurosciences Center of Excellence. The same issues that confront treatment of psychiatric disorders and neurodegenerative disorders also confront these conditions which don't have any effective treatments, where treatment may be multimodal, and effective therapies and cures are lacking. So I believe they would be covered by a Neurosciences Center of Excellence.
And I just wanted to add to what Matt said in terms of pain. I mean, I don't think you'd find a migraine sufferer who wasn't depressed. So that again, this is all part of, it's part of a continuum, and it all, and yes, they all of these things and perhaps and more than you listed would be covered by a Center of Excellence at the FDA for neuroscience.
Thank you. So one of the questions that has come in is really, I think, for Natalie and Diana, if you want to jump in too. You know, Tim talked a little bit about having a place where all stakeholders can come together and have a conversation with the people who are actually developing and approving the drugs and these novel treatments. What is it that you would want those individuals to know would be important to you when they're looking at developing treatments? What is it that you would want them to take from that?
I'd like to pass it off to Natalie to speak as the person who is living with Tourette syndrome.
So I think for me, what I want from medication is I want medication that treats the actual problem. I feel like the medications that I've been put on treats like problems that don't even have to deal with Tourette syndrome. Like I've been put on blood pressure medications or anxiety medications, which anxiety does increase tics, but it doesn't help the like original problem, which is the misfiring in my brain. So I think that medication that solely focused on the misfiring and the weird wiring that happens in my brain, and that just focused on that instead of other things that have nothing to do with Tourette syndrome, I think that would be what I would want from medication.
Thank
And Leslie, to follow on to that point, I think it's important that, you know, as this process moves forward, that they do have that patient focus, that being able to bring them in and hearing that experience directly from the people living with that condition is so important, because they know the value of what is needed more than anyone, to Natalie's points just now. So thank you.
I absolutely agree with that. So another question that has come in is—
I just add one
Sure.
thing to that, and that the problem is, and Natalie brought this up beautifully, we have these drugs that we use, but we don't know how they work. I mean, look at antidepressants. We have something called the most popular one are serotonin uptake inhibitors. But you inhibit serotonin uptake in an hour, and they take 2 months to work. Do they really work that way, or are we just guessing and blindly throwing something at a problem which sort of has some efficacy? So we need a lot of work, and we need a lot of help, and we need to approach this from many different angles if we're going to solve, to come up with true cures for neurological and psychiatric diseases.
So may I also add to what Mark's wisdom and also Natalie's. You know, we are often in a position where we have patients who have compelling problems, and we want to treat them. And we know that first of all, we don't know what the exact problem is that we're treating. We have a constellation of symptoms. So we try to be like Sherlock Holmes. We try to figure out what's the main problem. We try to figure out, is there anything available to treat it? We're often thinking by analogy. You know, we're often looking for metaphors and other conditions to find a drug that will help. And we often alleviate suffering by clever use of drugs that are applied for conditions for which they were not initially intended. There are so many stories of so much good that's come from this kind of approach. On the other hand, I think as Natalie brought out, there are side effects of drugs. And, you know, when the effect of a drug is broader than what you need, other things can go awry. I mean, we see it with antibiotics, for example. We see it with pain medications. So we do need a more focused approach. We do need probably to figure out mechanisms for approving drugs that are coming through the investigational pipeline. We do need more research to discover the mechanism. So it's not like a neuroscience center of excellence is going to be a panacea that cures all, that's going to make everything right for neurological conditions. It's going to widen the pipeline to bring discoveries of basic mechanisms through to figure out what drugs can potentially treat those specific targets and then get them approved. So we have to work at multiple levels, both scientifically and for advocacy. Neuroscience Center of Excellence is going to be great, but we also need the money for the basic research to discover what's really going on. So we have a lot of work ahead of us.
Thanks. So I think this question is for Tim, but others, please feel free to jump in. Tim, you talked about breakthrough therapy designation and other avenues that the FDA has for approving therapies. So how would the Neuroscience Center of Excellence modify FDA breakthrough therapy designation for promising interventions?
So I don't anticipate that the breakthrough therapy would change, or even the priority review would change. That still, I think, is well within the statutory responsibilities of the agency. But what the Center of Excellence would do is it would create the early environment for there to be, the kind of interactions to ensure that a program is able to, say, be designated for breakthrough therapy, or providing guidance in a more dynamic manner to sponsors, as well as those who'd be working with sponsors. Really, to me, it is about the environment, the Center of Excellence creating an environment for those early discussions, early collaborations that could then lead to the breakthrough therapy designation.
Great. So another question, and this one is related to funding. So will the ABC, will the American Brain Coalition, actively support additional funding for the NCOE to assure that it is effective? I mean, I can say yes to that. I think one of the things that we have advocated for is not just the Neuroscience Center of Excellence, but funding to ensure that it is implemented and implemented well. But I turn it over to you. I know you all have had conversations directly with FDA about the resources that would be necessary. So I turn it over to you to go into more detail on that.
Yes, we understand that in order to revise the structure at the FDA, that it will take some resources to recomprise and reorganize the divisions and to sustain the enhanced effort. We heard that directly from FDA leadership earlier this year, and we agree with it. And we are prepared to advocate strongly for resources to support the Neurosciences Center of Excellence in the FDA. It won't just happen by itself. I think it needs a commitment of direct allocation of funding, and we definitely support that. We read with interest an article recently in the Pink Sheet, which is a periodical that goes around Washington, that did allude to the need for support for FDA efforts for a dedicated center of excellence. We fully agree with that, and we fully support it. And our support for this comes with support for the funding. So we're here to help.
I think this question is sort of similar about FDA capacity and ability to implement a center like a Neuroscience Center of Excellence. So even before the COVID-19 pandemic, the FDA had a pretty weighty agenda, has a lot on its plate that it's dealing with. With the creation of a Neuroscience Center of Excellence, cause more resources toward be pulled away from FDA's clinical work, and how would it fit into the flow of what FDA does on its day-to-day basis?
I think the answer to that, it lies in the answer to the previous question. It is critical that there be a line of funding that would support the Neuroscience Center of Excellence, and that would allow the hiring of new dedicated and staff and specific staff. So no, I see it as actually complementing and enhancing rather than distracting.
I would like to add to that, those important comments that Mark made, that I believe that, you know, to make money, you have to spend money, sort of, that investing in this center of excellence will actually streamline processes, and through the improved efficiencies will actually save money. And then think about what's the goal of the FDA, which is to produce and to get out a timely, in a timely fashion, safe and effective treatments and cures. And the more quickly these treatments and cures get out, the greater the savings in terms of suffering and costs of diseases. And we heard staggering numbers of $1.5 trillion a year. You know, more than 100 million people in the US have neurological disorders. That costs a lot of money in terms of medications and lost work and wages and families having to stay home. So I think this is a case where a relatively small investment can go a long way.
Thank you. And so this is looping back to the BRAIN Act, HR 5435. So the Cures 2.0 Act does not specify that one of the intercenter institutes must be a neuroscience center of excellence. Are you confident that the intent of the Cures 2.0 Act was to create a neuroscience center of excellence? And in terms of the BRAIN Act, how would you envision that working together? Are you confident that that was the intent of Cures 2.0 would be to create a neuroscience center of excellence?
May I speak again, Leslie?
Of course, of course.
And briefly, and it's that it seems as if Cures 2.0 conditions for Center of Excellence fit neurosciences exactly. And so one of the criteria is something like at least 50 million people be affected. And we have far more than 50 million people affected in the US with mind and brain disorders, with CNS disorders. We have over 100 million. The costs are enormous. And in terms of favoring any one condition over another, actually there are probably about 1,000 conditions that fit under the umbrella of psychiatric, CNS, neurological disorders. So when you talk about an aggregate of conditions with an enormous impact on society, it's hard to imagine anything more compelling than CNS disorders. So I think if it isn't labeled exactly in Cures 2.0, it sure is pointing toward the neurosciences.
Yeah, and I think, and the important thing about the BRAIN Act is the BRAIN Act takes the aspects of what was outlined in Cures 2.0 and really shows how, neuroscience fits the bill when it comes to looking at establishing a neuroscience center of excellence, and then really authorizes that, and then authorizes and talks about the funding necessary to actually implement this to benefit FDA and allow FDA the resources it needs to make sure that this works well. Okay, I am not seeing any more questions. I'll give a couple more seconds just if anyone has a burning question that they want to get answered live. If not, please feel free to reach out to either Katie Sale from the American Brain Coalition or myself. We can follow up with any additional questions that you may have offline. Go ahead, Mark.
I do have a comment. I wanted to throw in a glimmer of hope. My daughter struggles with migraines. She's had headaches that have lasted for as long as 2 months. In the last year or so, there have been, and I think the number is 6, Matt can tell me if I'm right, new drugs approved for migraine, which for the first time target a specific mechanism that triggers the headache itself. So that we've been able to move from throwing things at it that might help the pain to beginning to develop a molecular strategy that can address a disease entity. And if we have a neuroscience center of excellence and we begin to work on these kind of strategies, hopefully there are going to be a lot of old diseases that benefit from new and new strategies that go with these therapies. Sorry to interrupt, but I
Oh,
thought
no, thank you, Mark. Thank
to
you
say
for that.
something positive.
Yes. And now to kind of build on that positive remark, let's, one of the things that we wanted to do is provide you with a way to support the Neuroscience Center of Excellence concept. We talked about the BRAIN Act. It's introduced by Representatives Blumenauer, Pascrell, and Bacon. They are also circulating a sign-on letter that would encourage the Energy and Commerce Committee to support the creation of a Neuroscience Center of Excellence. So to sign on, you can contact Asha in Representative Blumenauer's office. Her information is there. Chris in Rep. Pascrell's office, and Matthew with Representative Bacon's office. Their email addresses are on the screen for you. So if you are interested in either, you think your boss would be interested in co-sponsoring the bill, or if you'd like to sign on to the support letter, please give them a shout. They would love to hear from you. I also wanted to thank Natalie again, Natalie and her mom, for joining us today. Your testimony was wonderful. You're a terrific advocate, and thank you so much. I know it takes a lot to go and share your story, but you did it so beautifully and so powerfully. So thank you. To Dr. Kutsi, Dr. Resnick, and Dr. Rizzo, thank you for your time and expertise today. And for your continued work. And to Diana, thank you again for your continued advocacy for those impacted by Tourette's. Again, if you have questions, please feel free to reach out and let us know. An additional thank you to the offices of Congressional Neuroscience Co-Chair, Congressman Earl Blumenauer, the Brain Injury Task Force Co-Chairs, Bill Pascrell and Representative Bacon, for partnering with ABC today and having this briefing. And we look forward to continuing the conversation. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.